Okay, so in this chapter, I'm going to be sharing the process that I used to assemble the crankcase assembly for my 2.5 MFI hot rod build. All right, so let's start by taking the right-hand side of your case and attaching that to the engine stand. Once it's attached, you want to give it a very thorough cleaning. In my case, I used just normal alcohol and Kimtech wipes. Mine came back from the machine shop pretty clean, but I wiped down everything very thoroughly to make sure it was very, very clean. All right, now that the case is clean, let's start to assemble it. We're going to start with inserting a couple O-rings that are used for the oil pump into the case. You'll see there's a large size O-ring that goes into the case itself. That'll actually mate the oil pump to the case, and a smaller O-ring that goes in the perimeter of the case. Go ahead and insert those. Okay, so now you want to put the two O-rings into the oil pump itself. So go ahead and insert those. So the oil pump is held into the case by 3 oil pump lock tabs as shown in the photo here. Now please keep in mind that I am skipping ahead. I've already done all the dry fitting in my case. It's very important that you do all of the dry fit testing before you proceed with mounting things to the case permanently and pushing forward to sealing up the case. So let's go ahead and move forward here. We're going to take those locking tabs and 3 13mm nuts, and we're going to go ahead and insert your oil pump as well as the intermediate shaft assembly, which should all be together, into the case. These tabs, once those nuts are torqued down to 18.4 foot-pounds of torque each, use those tabs to basically bend up. So I used a small screwdriver and a hammer, just lightly tapped it up and then pounded it against the side of the nut. Okay, so now that we have the oil pump and intermediate shaft assembly in the case, we're going to go ahead and move on to the crankshaft. So starting with the small dowel pin that needs to be inserted into the saddle there for the number 8 bearing. All right, so let's go ahead and insert all of the bearings for the crankshaft. Once they're inserted, go ahead and apply assembly lube to each of the bearing surfaces. Make sure to apply an even coat across the surfaces. The crankshaft itself is pretty heavy, especially with all the rods attached to it. So to help, make sure that you can have everything aligned pretty easily when you go to drop it into the case. You may want to take the number 8 bearing, go ahead and put it onto the case, the saddle area where that dowel pin was inserted, and draw a line there along the left-hand side. That's going to give you another indicator when you're dropping the crank into the case to make sure that things are aligned and it finds the hole for the dowel pin fairly easily. Okay, so let's talk about the 2 seals that go on that number 8 bearing. There's going to be an O-ring seal as well as a pulley seal. The O-ring seal is pretty simple. You want to lubricate it maybe with a little bit of motor oil. Go ahead and slip that over the bearing and into the channel that it fits into. As far as the pulley seal itself, many recommend to assemble it dry. Others have recommended to coat the surface pretty lightly with Curel T. I actually kind of met in the middle. I put very, very little of that Curel T just on the very far back edge where that seal is going to butt up against. If you put too much, I've read some stories about the bearing actually being pushed out. So it's up to you if you want to be dry or if you want to apply something. But again, I kind of met in the middle, just put a very little amount on that very back edge. Okay, so now we're ready to go ahead and press in the pulley seal. So I just used a rubber mallet and just gently tapped it in evenly into the housing of the number 8 bearing. Once that's tapped in, I applied a small amount of assembly lube to the inner surface of that seal just to make sure when I slide that onto the crankshaft end there's no binding and then we don't tear the seal. Go ahead and clean up the end of your crankshaft. I use Kimtech wipes and alcohol to make sure mine was nice and clean, and then I applied some assembly lube to that surface. And go ahead and slide on the number 8 bearing, and that part is done. Okay, so let's move on to the other end of the crankshaft, onto the flywheel seal. Pretty simple here. You basically want to take your flywheel seal, lube up that inner surface area, kind of like we did with the number 8 bearing. The surface area that's going to attach or slide over on the crankshaft, make sure that's nice and clean. Again, I use Chemtech wipes and alcohol to clean that surface up. Lubed it up a little bit with assembly lube, and then just gently press that seal over the crankshaft assembly. Okay, so now the crankshaft assembly should be ready to be dropped into the case half. You've got the bearings inserted in the case half, they've been lubed. You've got the seals attached to the crankshaft itself. So go ahead and get yourself a helper. In my case, I grabbed my son. He helped me carry over the assembly. He was basically supporting the rods up, right? There's 3 rods that need to face up. 3 rods will fit through 3 of the cylinder holes or the spigots, and drop it into the case. Okay, so I'm getting pretty close to sealing up the case. I've spent quite a bit of time cleaning everything. So I've cleaned up not just the perimeter of the case, where we're going to use the Loctite 574 to seal it up, but really wiped down everything inside the case, anything I could get to, just to make sure there's just no particles in there. I've also got, as you can see, the rods held up so that they don't interfere when I drop the other half of the case on. I've also got the camshaft chain on this side, also supported, just to make sure I don't run into any problems putting the other half on. So everything's looking nice and clean, to the point where you could perform surgery on this surface. There were some things I didn't capture in my YouTube recordings, so I want to make sure that you understand that you need to attach the timing chains to the intermediate shaft assembly as part of this process. Those need to be attached to those sprockets, before you have everything bolted down there inside the crankcase half. Case. It's over here to the side waiting. It's all been cleaned up just like the other half, so everything was cleaned with those Chemtech wipes and alcohol. So this thing is spotless. All the bearings, of course, have been inserted. Assembly lube has been applied to each of the bearings, so they're ready to go. Let's come around over here. So I've also spent quite a bit of time to get everything ready for mating the case half. So all the bolts are ready. Everything's been cleaned up, right? So here's the through case bolts. I'm using the original bolts, washers, and acorn nuts, but they've all been cleaned up. Let's see. There's our head studs. I did clean up the original steel head studs. I'm reusing those. I'm going with ARP bolts for the flywheel. New chain ramps, and those are the bolts for the chain ramps. Replated pulley, got the thermostat with a new O-ring for that. Breather assembly, new gasket. There's all the O-rings they're going to be using on the case through bolts. All new nuts and aluminum washers for the case perimeter. And you'll see how I use these things in the build, but Loctite 574 for the perimeter. Loctite 271 will be used for some of the studs. Curel T will be used in certain places for extra protection of leaks. And Loctite 598 as well. Set of acid brushes, I'll use these to spread the Loctite 574 around the case perimeter. And then here's what I use for the final clean. Just simple isopropyl alcohol and these Chemtech whites. These things are awesome. These Chemtech whites are great. They don't leave any kind of residue, any fibers. So definitely recommend picking those up. All right, so we're about to seal up this crankcase. We got the left side here on the engine stand. Everything's been cleaned. The entire surface is ready to have the Loctite applied to it. Got my son here. He's actually going to help carry that other half of the case over, and we'll carefully put it down once we've got the Loctite applied. So should be fun. A little nerve-wracking to think that it's going to be sealed up, but here we go. All right, so the time has come to apply the Loctite 574 adhesive to the case perimeter. Everything's been cleaned up. Everything's ready to go. So I took the approach of a fairly liberal amount of the Loctite 574, kind of in the middle of the case perimeter. I went all the way around the outside, paying close attention to the number 8 bearing, getting right up against the bearings themselves. Also with the intermediate shaft assembly area, just making sure you're getting those edges there. I decided against applying any kind of adhesive, this Loctite 574 or any other adhesive for that matter, on the bearing saddles themselves. From my understanding, Porsche did not do this. There was also some concerns out there that it could possibly throw off the bearing tolerances, right, by not getting enough clamping across the bearing saddles. Again, a ton of mixed opinions on that. I am by no means an engine building expert, but I decided against it. I just didn't think the risk was worth it for me personally. Okay, so once you've applied the Loctite 574 around the perimeter of the case, you want to go ahead and take an acid brush and go around and just spread it out. You want to make sure you get a nice even cover across the surface area of the case perimeter, just to make sure that all the areas are covered. Again, pay special attention not to get any of that adhesive on the bearings themselves up at the crankshaft area, as well as the intermediate shaft area. Okay, so once the Loctite 574 is spread evenly around the perimeter, you want to go ahead and have the other half of the case ready to go. And in my case, again, I grabbed my son. He helped me carry the other case half over, being very, very careful not to touch any of the perimeter mating surface, right? That's been cleaned spotless. We didn't want any fingerprints on that, no oils or anything like that. Anyway, so we walked it over. We carefully flipped it over and slid it over the 3 upright rods as well as that timing chain. Once that was on, I took a rubber mallet and just kind of gently tapped across the surface of the case half, trying to evenly push it down to where it would met up with the other side. Okay, now that the 2 case halves are pressed together, the clock starts to run. In my case, using Loctite 574, I have about 45 minutes before it cures. So I went ahead and had my son set a timer for 45 minutes, and we went to work to attach all of the bolts and nuts. Okay, so it's very important that you've got all of the hardware laid out and ready to go. Again, as I mentioned, these adhesives cure pretty fast. In fact, I think the Loctite 574 is one of the adhesives that gives you a little bit more time because the clock really doesn't start to run until there's no more oxygen, right? And so the 2 case halves are pressed together, and then from that point, you've got about 45 minutes. So I had all the hardware ready to go. Again, I did have my son ready to help me out here. So we followed Wayne Dempsey's instructions in terms of the order to which we were going to torque down the various bolts and nuts across the case. You really start with the through bolts. There's a specific order in which you crank those down. So we went ahead and started there. He held the bolt side with a wrench in place while I cranked down on the nut side using a torque wrench. And then once those were torqued down, we torqued down all of the nuts around the perimeter of the case. There's also a few hidden nuts. I think there were 3 of them. One inside the timing chain housing area. I think there was a 15 millimeter nut, and then a couple additional acorn nuts inside the oil cooler assembly area. The torque settings for the case through bolts is 25.8 foot-pounds of torque, and the nuts that cover the perimeter of the crankcase are tightened down to 18.4 foot-pounds of torque. Another hotly debated item, at least based on my research in the various forums, was the O-rings that slide across the case through bolts. In my case, I ended up using the factory red O-rings. There's also blue, there's green, and I ended up using very little of the Loctite 598 to the O-rings themselves against the washer. The washers that made up against these O-rings are beveled out. If you read Wayne Dempsey's book, he actually recommends a pretty liberal amount. Of course, if you get opinions from others, folks will say that you shouldn't use any for fear of some of that RTV breaking off and getting inside the motor, which I certainly have that concern as well. So again, I used a very small amount, just kind of in that bevel area, hoping that it would protect against some leaks. The challenge with these O-rings is they're pinched, right? So even though I told my son to hold his wrench as tight as he could, particularly on the bolt side, the case itself is not beveled out, and they're going to get squished. And again, if you read, some feel as though that's the design, that's actually the compression that's designed for that O-ring. whereas the nut side, they don't tend to be compressed. In fact, when I disassembled my motor, my motor had never been split. It was original 2.4, never split. The O-rings were completely intact on the nut side, not damaged at all, and pretty well shredded on the nut side. So it looks like it's the factory had the same issue, and it just may be the design, I don't know. All right, so it looks like I had success here. There's an even amount of Loctite 574 that has been pinched out or squeezed out along the perimeter of the case. It's very even amount, in fact. So I feel pretty good about my application of the sealant there. When I look around the case, there's only a couple areas where it wasn't pinched out, and it was really because I had touched those areas. So as we were flipping the case and tightening down all the nuts and those bolts, my hands rubbed across a couple areas and actually wiped it off onto my arms. So feeling pretty good. It's time to clean the excess material off the case. Okay, so now that excess Loctite 574 has been cleaned off from the case, it's time to go ahead and start inserting these head studs. So I used a little bit of Loctite 271 there on the threads and started to insert those into the case. I used just a couple nuts on the end of each of the studs, tightened up against each other to go ahead and turn them or tighten them into the case. The key here is you want each of these studs to be 135 millimeters above the beveled surface of the case. So you want to make sure that you're tightening those in deep enough to where that measurement is correct, right? So 135 millimeters from the case surface to the end of the head stud. Okay, so let's go ahead and move forward with mounting the 4 inward chain ramps. The brown chain ramp is mounted in the lower right position as you're facing the motor, and then the remaining 3 are the standard black chain ramps. When you're mounting the chain ramps to the case, you do want to make sure that the longer ends are pointing towards the center of the case. So for each of the chain ramp bolts, you also want to apply a new aluminum seal, and you want to torque down each of those bolts to 18.4 foot-pounds of torque. All right, so let's go ahead and mount the thermostat into the crankcase. You want to apply a small amount of motor oil around the O-ring that'll slip over. All right, so using new thermostat nuts, torque those down to 8.1 foot. Okay, so my case did have the oil bypass mod done to it, so as a result, I will be installing the new oil pressure piston and spring assemblies into my case. The longer spring assembly, along with the guide, will go into the bottom of the engine. Go ahead and apply a little bit of assembly lube to the piston itself. Insert that spring assembly into the area and go ahead and torque that down to 44.2 foot-pounds of torque. All right, let's move on to the shorter spring. This is the one that's mounted into the side of the crankcase. Same as the one that goes in the bottom. Go ahead and lube it up with a little bit of assembly lube. Slide it to the case and torque it down, 44.2 foot-pounds of torque. Okay, we can go ahead and mount the crankcase breather assembly to the case using new nuts, and you want to torque those down to 8.1 foot-pounds of torque. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and mount the intermediate shaft cover using a brand new gasket. You want to torque down all 3 of those. I also use new nuts here at 7.4 foot-pounds of torque. Okay, and here we go. This is a moment of truth. So I went ahead and used some rubber bands to kind of support the rods there on the head studs. But anyway, gave the pulley a turn, and sure enough, the crankshaft turned around smoothly. There was no binding, didn't require a bunch of effort. So I think we're good. I think the crankcase assembly is good to go.